paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
You want answers.
I want the truth.
You can't handle the truth.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Nick Bryant podcast. Today, my guest is Mal Hyman. He is a professor of sociology and political science at Coverup University, and he's written an amazing book called Burying the Lead, in which he shows how the media completely corrupted any kind of truth that was involved with the JFK assassination. How you doing today, Mal?
I'm doing well. Glad to join you.
And give us a little background. How did you get interested in the media and the JFK assassination?
I'm from a media family. My dad was a small town newspaper publisher. My brother's in broadcast journalism, as is my niece. And when I started talking about the assassination of John Kennedy, I realized when I taught in the public schools that students were very interested. So I kept reading on it. And by the time I taught in a state prison, I found inmates were interested, guest lectures would come in. So I read everything that I could at first. And when I started teaching at Coverup University, they allowed me to teach a class on political assassinations. And one of the students in my class said, "Oh, I know Congressman Richardson Pryor, who headed the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Would you like to meet him?" And he was a wonderful guy to talk to. We went at it for a couple hours. And at the very end of the conversation, he said, "The CIA, the military, and the FBI did not cooperate with my committee. The military destroyed files. I needed a lot more time and money, and keep up the good work." This is 1989. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm digging into this, and I'm going to look at why the media didn't do more. And I was at it for 30 years, and there's still plenty more that you could get to on it. But at a certain point, I was getting weary, and I thought, I better get the information out there and then do my revisions afterwards. So I've been working on this for a while, and I'll try to revise the book. But that was what got me into writing on it.
I've been a maven of the CIA's takeover of the media for quite some time. And I've written about Operation Mockingbird in a previous book, which was the CIA's plan to take over the media. And you bring in some pretty interesting numbers here. You say globally, I'm just quoting your book, globally at its peak in 1967, the CIA communications empire embraced more than 800 news and public information organizations and individuals. It was known inside the CIA as Wisner's Wurlitzer. Wisner was the head of Mockingbird, and he boasted that he could play any chord he wanted on his mighty Wurlitzer and ultimately change public opinion. So 800 news and public information organizations, that's a lot.
Absolutely. I met one of the researchers for the Church Committee, Senator Church's investigation of the CIA, and he had gone to the same grad school with me. And this was years later when I invited him to Coker for a conference on the assassination of John Kennedy at the outset of the movie JFK. I said, in your report, you talk about 400 to 600 reporters working with the CIA in one way or another. And he was pretty clear. It was at least that many. We still don't have the names of all of those reporters, the Beta report is still classified. As your viewers probably know, and you know, thousands of pages still classified on the assassination. So I thought this was vital for us to glean this information. During that period, there was support for democratic socialist magazines and outlets all over Europe, and they were seen as harmless and on our side because they were anti-communist, something a lot of folks would perhaps be surprised with. And there were relationships of all sorts with reporters and news outlets. You know, to circle back, major news outlet at the time, the Associated Press, was fully supportive of the Warren Commission, not only in '63 with their book Torches Past, but by 1967, they reissued that book and didn't change anything, even though the critics had gained some traction and even some of the mainstream media were raising objections and contradictions with the Warren Report. It is hard to imagine how extensive our propaganda was at that time. And of course, it was justified as being patriotic during the Cold War. So you're right, it's a remarkable chapter in American history. And we really don't know the extent of those connections today, although they're formally denied. We haven't had a full investigation of the CIA in decades. I know a congressman that sat on the House Intelligence Committee in the 1980s that tried to talk about the Iran-Contra operations, and he granted some interviews to public broadcasting, and they froze him out of the committee by not giving him information. They would just give briefings to the ranking members of the committee. So he ultimately quit the committee. But they have their ways of keeping the information from us. And, you know, as you rightly point out, it was extensive.
And this is from your book also. At the height of the Cold War, the CIA made 70 to 80 insertions into various media outlets every day. So to do that, that requires a lot of CIA personnel overseeing a lot of different media.
Yeah, the propaganda operations were extensive. We never quite got the breakdown for where their budget went, but they realized Cold War, a propaganda war, that they were going to fight for the hearts and minds. And in regards to political assassinations or the war in Vietnam, they were good at spinning stories, as was the military. And sometimes what gets lost in this is the role of the military and their operations and intelligence, which by many accounts was far more extensive than the CIA, and we really don't have much of an accounting of it. I've talked to John Newman. You and some of your viewers are probably aware of some of his work on JFK and political assassinations. And I asked him, well, how many reporters were military intelligence influencing? And he said to me, he wondered that as well. So it wasn't just CIA operations. And I think it's also fair to say there was cooperation with the military and the CIA during that period. And then there's the FBI and their influence over the mainstream media. So I think we're still piecing together just how extensive that influence was over the mainstream media.
As I talked to you before we started recording, I was in a documentary that looked at the military-industrial complex in Hollywood and the amount of influence the military had over Hollywood was pretty mind-boggling. There's maverick directors like Oliver Stone, but a lot of directors fall into place with propaganda. They're more than happy to. And this is another quote from your book, and it's got to be true because it's in the New York Times. According to the New York Times, the CIA has at times owned or subsidized more than 50 newspapers, news services, radio stations, periodicals, and other communication entities. So there again, we've got this huge labyrinth of media that's controlled by the CIA.
It's hard for us to imagine. And the ties were at many different levels. There would be a James Angleton, head of counterintelligence, that tended to train and run reporters in the New York Times. And then there are other reporters that just felt it their patriotic duty, if they visited a Bulgaria or Romania, to come back and have a dinner with the CIA and let them be debriefed. So it's the whole spectrum, partly to gather information, but partly to influence public opinion. And I just wonder, with 9/11 or the assassination of Robert Kennedy or Martin Luther King, how extensive their assets were deployed, because we've written less in those areas. I noticed a new book out by Norman Solomon on the way the media was influenced regarding the war in Iraq and the lead up to the war in Iraq. And now we don't hear about the war in Iraq or what's going on in Iraq. And we know that was true after the invasion of Panama. We're not hearing about Afghanistan. A couple years after Vietnam, we heard very little about Vietnam. We never hear about Vietnam today. So the nature of this coverage is still to be explored. It is extensive. And as Carl Bernstein said in an interview in 1992, this is one of the areas in understanding American politics that's underexplored. In our conversation, you talked about some of the difficulties with Woodward and Bernstein, and I don't know if you've shared that with your listeners, but that was fascinating material to me. But Bernstein observed it in '92 that we have not done anything close to what we need to do in order to create a viable democracy. And I'd say at this point, some of the strategies that are used by Fox News are right out of Germany in the 1930s. The big lie, constant repetition, constant attack, so that those who disagree with you aren't adversaries that are misinformed. They're the enemy of the people. And this has gone on for a while.
Well, Jefferson said that newspapers are the most important part of a democracy. And he said that before 6 corporations own 90% of the media, and before Mockingbird. Yeah. And here's some more stats from your book. American news organizations had employed, though sometimes only on a casual basis, American journalists working in 25 organizations that included ABC, CBS, Time, Life, Newsweek, the New York Times, Associated Press, United Press International, Scripps, Howard, Hearst newspaper chain, the Christian Science Monitor, and the Wall Street Journal. So that's like most of the media that people imbibe.
Yeah, I think, as a general framework, we might want to consider their active involvement at the outset with the Council on Foreign Relations, set up 1921 at Harvard to bring in leaders in business, banking, politics, journalism, and academia to look at U.S. foreign policy and economic policy. And the media has always been there. The Dulles brothers took turns heading that organization, and it's always had reporters like Walter Lippmann and a range of editors and publishers and owners that have been part of it. And people who had looked at media coverage of the assassination of John Kennedy, people like Jerry Polikoff that I know you're aware of. Jerry was a close friend and worked on my congressional campaign. And Jerry said that there woven into the leading institutions in the United States. And I think the Council on Foreign Relations would be the most powerful one. And a book, Who Rules America by G. William Domhoff, gets into some of this material. I had the great good fortune of being required to read that book in 1968 as a freshman at UCLA. Now it's in its 8th edition, and I think it's useful background for that context.
The free press isn't so free, and I found that out when I started pitching a book called The Franklin Scandal. Well, actually, I started pitching an article first, and then I started pitching the book, and I was met with a tsunami of skepticism and incredulity, but no one asked me to show them the documentation that I had, because I had substantial documentation backing up what I was saying, but they just didn't want to trifle with it. And you quote New York Times Chief of Staff John Swinton, and I really like this quote. You know it, and I know it. There is not one of you who dare to write your honest opinions, and if you do, you would it would, you know, that it would never appear in print, and you would be so foolish to write on it if you would be so foolish to write honest opinions. So this is the Chief of Staff of the New York Times saying, if you're honest, you're going to have a hard time in the world of journalism.
There we've seen a number of journalists that ultimately quit because they couldn't get stories that were well documented in print. People like Jefferson Morley and Jim Mars that ended up doing terrific research on political assassinations were once mainstream journalists. Earl Goals for the Dallas Morning News, similarly. Peter Keyes of the New York Times, ostracized for covering this material. And the paradigm that we're looking at with the coverage of the assassination of President Kennedy is quite similar with the mainstream coverage of the assassination of Martin Luther King. And, you know, the 60th anniversary of King's I Have a Dream speech, the mainstream media could look into what happened with that political assassination, and they are steadfastly avoid that, as well as what King was saying in 1968. Just as we don't really get all of what President Kennedy was saying in 1963 on foreign policy and where he wanted to take the nation. So yeah, we have editing that's at levels that are quite surprising, and that we're still working to overcome.
It's interesting. William Pepper has written a number of books about the assassination of Martin Luther King, and I've found most of them to be pretty edifying. Let's jump into the JFK assassination. You talk about, there was the Warren Commission was in the 60s, but after the Warren Commission, the Zapruder film came out. It was viewed publicly, and there was a tremendous amount of outrage that we'd been lied to, and that led to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And that committee, its final report in 1979 said that JFK was probably assassinated via a conspiracy. But most of the mass media denigrated the conclusions. And a decade later, the Department of Justice quietly concluded that no further investigations appear to be warranted unless new information is available. So the House Select Committee in 1979 said it was most likely a conspiracy, but the Justice Department didn't follow up on it.
That's an accurate overview. And if I might move back historically to give a little bit of context on some of that. After Watergate, the public knew that the FBI and CIA had lied, they were less trustworthy, and that also contributed to public opinion pushing for further investigations. There was a sense, and I got to admit I was a bit surprised about this, that after Watergate, the press and many in government thought that the media had gone too far. And there are statements even from people who had worked as editors from the Washington Post that they wished that the media wasn't so strong, that maybe the balance of power had shifted too much in Washington. Nonetheless, the committees were able to get traction, and part of it was the 1975 showing on Good Morning America, ABC, and Geraldo Rivera having the Zapruder film shown. And Dick Gregory was a part of that, and Robert Groden, that was the photo expert. And actually, ABC was equivocating on it. And Geraldo Rivera said, either the film goes on and we do this show or I quit. And essentially, they went back to Geraldo Rivera and said, you're going to take all liability on this one, which he did. It showed, and as you rightly point out, it was a firestorm from the general public, and it helped create the public push for an investigation, which we did get with the House Select Committee, even though it was underfunded, that the CIA liaison, we now know was George Joannides, who might well have worked with Oswald. And we now know the chief counsel for the House Select Committee, Robert Blakey, has said publicly for years that the CIA lied to his committee and he wouldn't accept anything that they said unless they could corroborate it. The committee still was able to say shots came from the front and behind, probably a conspiracy, which was seen in the New York Times and the Washington Post as perhaps a coincidence of two shooters shooting at the same time, if you will, a coincidence theory of history. And you're also right that the Justice Department did not pursue it. And I would submit by 1989, all of the institutions in America had faltered, not just the FBI and the CIA, Congress, the churches, academe. This was drifting into history until Oliver Stone boldly put together the movie JFK, which created a firestorm. The press largely damned it. There was a book about the movie documenting every line in the movie, but most people weren't reading and the press didn't read it. And it did still lead to an assassination records and review board that declassified over 4 million pages of documents that Congress hadn't seen. It was a filmmaker that catalyzed the next phase of the investigation.
Well, it's interesting. You talked about Art Blakey saying that the CIA wouldn't cooperate with him. And he has stated publicly that he felt like organized crime could have been involved in the assassination, but he didn't feel that the CIA was, which I think is kind of interesting considering that the CIA wouldn't cooperate with him at all.
Well, that's a good point. And initially, he pointed to the role of organized crime. And only later, after the work done on George Joannides, did he realize that he'd been lied to, and talked about that he didn't trust the CIA. So I think he came to that somewhat belatedly. But you're right, at first he was pointing to organized crime, which always felt way too limited. You could point to Jack Ruby and his involvement with organized crime. But as Oliver Stone pointed out, Jim Garrison had pointed out before him, that they were a piece of the puzzle, that they certainly couldn't have choreographed the media or the cover-up afterward or the Warren Commission, so that at best they were a part of what happened. But you're right, that wasn't said initially by Blakey.
Now it's interesting. You get into various intelligence assets that are in journalism, that speak or that write quite a bit, like within days of the assassination. And you discuss a intelligence asset named Priscilla Johnson, and she was employed by the Boston Globe. And on the day of the assassination, she said that Oswald was a fanatic and he acted alone. And the title of her article was "That Stuff of Which Fanatics Are Made." And she blamed Oswald as his motivation was he was a crazed Marxist. The day after Kennedy is shot, she's the CIA asset in the Boston Globe is proclaiming that. That's pretty telling, if you ask me.
Absolutely. And then you have Hal Hendricks working with the Miami News.
Yes.
And he's a CIA, long-term CIA asset, spinning the story with Seth Cantor in order to make it appear that Oswald has ties to Russia and Cuba, but no ties to anyone else. That story was out there at the outset. I think it was the day of the assassination. Then you have Earl Cabell, whose brother Charles had worked with the CIA and Allen Dulles and was fired after the Bay of Pigs. Earl Cabell's the mayor of Dallas, telling the media that Oswald was a lone assassin, again, trying to spin the media from day one. And then you have when Jack Ruby kills Oswald, and the memo coming from the FBI and from Bill Moyers saying that the public must be convinced that Oswald was the lone assassin and he didn't have Confederates. That's coming from some pretty powerful sources. And the media tends to back off on viewing some of the contradictions. Oh, and I might also add that reporter Connie Kritzberg, who was in Dealey Plaza during the assassination, had written that she thought shots came from the front and behind, and her editor was visited by the FBI to influence the subsequent stories. And we also have the doctors at Parkland Hospital that are visited by the Secret Service in order to make sure that essentially the doctors there that performed the autopsy were saying things that were consistent. The doctors that tried to save President Kennedy in Parkland were saying the same things that the doctors said during the autopsy at Bethesda later that night. So the Secret Service had visited those doctors and essentially told them to stay quiet. And we know what the name of one of the Secret Service people was Elmer Moore. So we have a pressure on the press as well as on the physicians and some of the newspapers coming from the FBI and the Secret Service early on.
Ruby has been portrayed as this kind of low-life marginal character, but he was heavily plugged into organized crime, the outfit in Chicago. He was running guns into Cuba. And this is kind of interesting. This is like a quote from your book. DA Henry Wade mistakenly told the press that Oswald belonged to the Free Cuba Committee. Ruby unexpectedly pointed out that the DA had meant the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, a pro-cap. So Ruby knows exactly what Oswald's background is. Fair Play for Cuba. That cracks me up.
Yeah, there were 8 different witnesses that said that he had met with Oswald.
Yes.
And Ruby seems mid-level mafia. He was in debt. He was ordered to go after Oswald in my mind. Probably threatened, maybe family members were threatened. There was probably carrots and sticks that were offered. The reporter that was going to break the story on Jack Ruby, when Jack Ruby was arrested, was Dorothy Kilgallen. And some of your listeners may not know, but she was as big at the time as a reporter as Oprah was in her heyday. And she had written stories about Jack Ruby and what he was saying, and was on the verge of giving her biggest interviews, and was writing a book on this. And somehow, mysteriously, she commits suicide at the age of 52. And there were a number of physicians that, when they looked over this information, didn't think that it was suicide. I'm not convinced at all that it was suicide. Cyril Wecht from Duquesne Law School, who's written extensively on political assassinations, also has very significant doubts about this. She was at the peak of her career, breaking the biggest story of her career, and it was about Jack Ruby, and Ruby felt comfortable talking to her. And you may have seen the footage of Jack Ruby when he was interviewed in 1965, and he said, "This goes to the highest places." Now, what he meant by that is unclear, but I think Ruby may well have talked before he died of cancer in prison in 1967. So we really don't know the whole story with Ruby, but like you, I think he was not a low-level operative, and I think he knew Oswald well.
There's a number of eyewitness accounts that Ruby knew Oswald, and United Press International reported about Ruby. His sister told reporters that his motive for killing Oswald must have been his intense admiration for Kennedy. So, and actually, the other reason why he killed Kennedy, or why he killed Oswald, it's said that he didn't want to see Jacqueline Kennedy go through a trial. So here we have this gangster who's so moved by the Kennedys, has such admiration for the Kennedys, that he's going to shoot Lee Harvey Oswald and save Jacqueline Kennedy from testifying at a trial. Now, that is a lot of bullshit.
Yeah, it was a very touching story that came from Ruby's lawyer, Tom Howard. Yeah, it was just a cover story on it. Ruby met with the FBI a number of times through the 1950s and early 60s, and we don't know the nature of those meetings, so he may have been caught and compromised a ways back. I can't go any further than that, but clearly the mafia and their involvement and prosecutions of the mafia dropped off 80% after President Kennedy was killed. He clearly was prosecuting the mafia, and clearly mafia figures had helped him in his election in 1960 in Illinois and in Missouri. But Ruby was organized crime. He had other connections, but the mafia clearly couldn't have done this by themselves. And the story about given by Tom Howard, Ruby's lawyer, was just a cover story.
And it's interesting, before Ruby shot Oswald, Oswald had been stamped as a lone nutter by the New York Times, the New York Herald Tribune, the Los Angeles Times, the Dallas Morning News, Associated Press, United Press International, CBS, and Time Life. So they all, even before Oswald was shot by Ruby, all these news organizations claimed that he was a lone nutter. Now that's amazing.
Yeah, I don't see that as a coincidence. And you had initial reports that talked about shots coming from the front on local TV in Dallas, and written reports around the country. So there was plenty to proceed with. And an official story fell into place very, very quickly, which raises more questions than we have answers for. I speculated in my book that there was a voluntary censorship code that was enacted, but that's pure speculation to be used in time of crisis. I'm not sure if that was mobilized or not, but that had a number of journalists as well as people in and out of high office in the United States. But it is notable and worthy of further research that the official story moved so quickly. And I suppose some of the mass media was maybe told that Oswald has Russian and Cuban ties, and this could lead to a response on the part of the United States that could lead to World War III. I think there might have been some sort of cover story put in place, similar to what Johnson used to finally convince Earl Warren to serve on the Warren Commission, the presidential commission, later called the Warren Commission. And that was the story. And we know that from phone conversations between Johnson and Earl Warren. That story could have been given to some of the press early on.
What's interesting is you've got Oswald defecting to Russia. He's got some security clearances. And then he comes back and nothing seems to happen to him. He doesn't seem to be, I'm not aware of him even getting interrogated by law enforcement. Is there any accounts of that?
Well, you're right. That was one of the contradictions early on that caught my attention. Here he's at Atsugi, where we're flying the U-2 flights, and this is top secret clearance. And this guy had been trained to speak Russian at El Toro Marine Base. He was part of a false defector program. He marries a Soviet woman and lives there for a while, and then comes back into the United States, and there's no formal debriefing. And he's with people in Dallas and New Orleans that have ties to the military-industrial complex, that are powerful oil barons, people with FBI and CIA ties. Yeah, it's remarkable. And he was not formally debriefed when he returned to the United States. At the height of the Cold War, if you or I would have defected, we would have been debriefed. They would have questioned us. They would have wondered whether we were some sort of sleeper spy that was set in motion. I mean, Oswald ends up meeting with a number of people who had ties to the CIA and ties to the FBI. The story becomes all the more remarkable as you follow the trail. There are CIA people that said that he was on the CIA payroll. We have Oswald arrested in New Orleans when he's getting into a fight with Carlos Bringuer, and he's visited by FBI people. Quigley was the FBI agent's name, and those files have been destroyed, but he visited with FBI people after distributing Fair Play for Cuba literature. So this warrants a lot more coverage and investigation. And as Senator Schweiker said in 1975 when he looked at this, Oswald's background has fingerprints of intelligence all over it. They knew it back then. And from the declassification of documents, we know even more about this. I want to make another point, if I might go off on a tangent. While Oliver Stone's movie JFK was hammered in the mainstream media, there were some that said he was raising good questions. And in the alternative media, they talked about him doing a good job. 30 years later, after more than 4 million pages of documents have been declassified, Oliver Stone and Jim Diogenio put out JFK Revisited as a 2 and 4 hour documentary. And I would submit that needs a lot of coverage, but it was greeted with silence in the mainstream media.
It's on Showtime, and I've watched it, and I found it to be a very good documentary. This is something that I didn't know. This one caught me by surprise from your book. From what I understand, Oswald and Maria were helped by Travelers Aid Society getting back to the United States. And you discuss Travelers Aid Society having CIA connections. Now that I'd never read or heard. That was pretty interesting to me.
Yeah, well, they worked closely with the emigre organizations, the Tolstoy Foundation. And this was in part to vet and coordinate the so-called White Russian community, to be able to determine if people were coming into the United States and there was anything that the CIA had to worry about. So they worked with the Tolstoy Foundation. And Ralph Gannis gets into this some, and H.R. Albarelli, and I think is an important nexus for us to look at, because Oswald clearly was meeting with very powerful business people, oil barons, retired military people in the so-called White Russian community in Dallas.
And what led to the Warren Commission, this is kind of interesting. Again, I didn't know this. Johnson was going to have the FBI in the state of Texas carry out an investigation, but Joseph Alsop, who is a Washington Post columnist and also a CIA asset, said, Lyndon, why don't we put together a blue ribbon commission to look at it? And Johnson liked the idea so much, ergo the Warren Commission.
Yeah, the Alsops had worked for years with the CIA. They were assets, highest level, very, very clever people. And Johnson also, I think, was persuaded that he better have one investigation, otherwise there could be contradictory evidence and conclusions. So he tried to fold it into the Warren Commission, which probably your viewers know had no real supporter of John Kennedy on the commission, and a number of people who had close ties to the CIA and FBI. It was known that Gerald Ford was the FBI's best asset in Washington. And yet Allen Dulles, who was fired
by JFK,
by John Kennedy, appointed by Johnson, and he's the most active member of the Warren Commission. You have John McCloy, who had worked with him at the highest levels with political propaganda after World War II. He's also appointed to the Warren Commission. So yeah, it leads to Alsop was critical in moving Johnson that direction.
And what's interesting to me with the Warren Commission is that its sole investigatory arm was the FBI. So what the FBI came up with is what the Warren Commission was going to present to us. And J. Edgar Hoover hated the Kennedys, and Lyndon Johnson wasn't fond of the Kennedys himself. In fact, there's a book by Philip Hansen. Are you familiar with that book that indicts Johnson as being part of the Kennedy assassination?
I've read a number of books and heard a number of presentations to that effect. And I think it's fair to note that not only was there angry feuding, there was distrust, dislike, and Robert Kennedy had researched Johnson's empire and his connections. And Johnson's top aide, Bobby Baker, was coming up before the Senate Judiciary Committee, and they had all sorts of information was going to make life miserable and convict, or at least raise the information that could lead to easy convictions of Bobby Baker. And then Johnson's career would be ruined. And the Kennedys were looking to get rid of Johnson and appoint somebody else to the vice presidency. And Johnson and all the people around Johnson knew that was going to happen later in November of 1963. Johnson was the most powerful figure in Texas, instrumental in bringing Kennedy to Texas. And whatever happened with the planning of this conspiracy for the assassination had to include Lyndon Johnson, because he would be instrumental in setting up some sort of commission and covering it up. Some people had talked about Allen Dulles having a major hand in it. I think there's a lot to support that, but there's probably a Johnson working with an Allen Dulles, and I think that probably is your nexus for who were the sponsors of the assassination and their supporters, which would lead us to the oil community and some of the Council on Foreign Relations. So yeah, I'd say Johnson had a hand in it, and a lot of those books were pretty compelling, but I don't think it was either Johnson or Dulles. I think they had to cooperate.
David Talbot has written a book about Dulles called The Devil's Chessboard. And he shows how malevolent Allen Dulles was. And actually, Allen Dulles's kid had a brain injury and from some type of combat. And he put his own kid through MK Ultra in a hope that it would get him better. I mean, he subjected his own son to MK Ultra, which I find just kind of mind-boggling. Now it's interesting jumping back.
The book is brilliant. I'm sorry,
Yes.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I thought that was a terrific contribution that Dave Talbot made. And he gets into some of Dulles's operations during World War II with the OSS, cutting deals with the Nazis. I mean, he was freewheeling. That was always his style. And setting up ties with covert operatives that had worked with Hitler at the highest level, like Otto Skorzeny. I mean, Talbot's book is a tour de force and ought to be required reading in political science. I think he did a great job. And, I'm reminded of James Angleton's interview. Angleton, head of counterintelligence, worked with Dulles for years. And he gives an interview to Joe Trento in which it's a deathbed confession. And he essentially says the CIA was set up by liars, and those who were pathological liars and the most ambitious got to the top. And he said they were penetrated by the outside and there was no oversight. And his words, it turned to shit. That was Angleton with a deathbed confession. Angleton, who worked closely with Allen Dulles.
Angleton was one scary dude. His fanaticism and alcoholism combined made him a very frightening guy.
He would run some of his assets, would be training New York Times reporters, and he'd be running them, feeding them information. It's like he ran his own separate shop for some of the propaganda. And he was penetrated by the Soviets as well, which led to some of the alcoholism. To turn back to what you were saying about Dulles, he had an almost cult-like hold over some of the people that he worked with from World War II and shortly thereafter, such that when he was fired, they were still meeting with him at his home in DC. And I think he was still the power that was defining some of policy. And this is Dave Talbot's research, and that a number of the top people like Helms and Angleton were still meeting with Dulles after he was fired, which always made sense to me because McCone, who headed the CIA, was really appointed by Kennedy. And while he was a Republican businessman, he really wasn't necessarily loyal to the CIA at first. So when people talked about the CIA involvement in an assassination, I never felt it went to McCone, but more rogue factions that were more loyal to Dulles.
I would say that Helms, CIA Director Helms, was certainly involved. He strikes me as another very malevolent guy that ran the CIA.
Man who knew the secrets. Yeah.
Yes, Richard Helms. And during the Church Commission, William Colby was willing to discuss covert activities of the CIA, whereas Helms absolutely wasn't. And the unbelievably sadistic MK Ultra experiments that were performed on Americans and Canadians, Helms ordered all those records to be destroyed. Some of them did survive, and it shows how truly horrific MK Ultra could be, but I wonder how much more horrific it was if all those documents could be released. But he
I wonder that too, and I wonder why the military destroyed their Oswald files so quickly, or why the Secret Service destroyed their files once they were ordered by the Assassination Record and Review Board to turn them over, or why the Secret Service destroyed some of their files on what happened before and on January 6th of 2021.
Now it's interesting, the Zapruder film, let's look at that a little bit. Definitely shows that there was a headshot from the grassy knoll, or to the right. And you said that it ended up at Photo Interpretation Center pretty quickly. Could you tell us about that? And what is Photo Interpretation Center, National Photo Interpretation Center?
That was the center that was set up to analyze video and photography, and could have been used to alter photographs or videography. And it's interesting that it was there, and there are a range of different arguments as to what happened to it. I don't want to claim to be an expert on the Zapruder film. I've reported what other people have said and tried to clarify some of the contending views with it. I'm content to look at the 51 witnesses in Dealey Plaza that said shots came from the right front, and to look at probably an edited version of the Zapruder film that looks to me like the president's head is snapping backward, not forward. And I'm convinced that there were at least two shooters. I've been at a number of conferences where you could talk about three shooters from lower on the Dow Tex building, and it could match the autopsy reports. I don't want to claim to be an expert on that. I'm convinced that if shooters were from the front and behind, that it was a conspiracy. But I think it's important to note that it went to the NPIC, and they did work for the CIA and for the FBI. And I kind of leave it at that. I don't want to claim to be a photographic expert.
Well, what's interesting is Walter Cronkite was the most trusted man in America. And then Dan Rather took over that mantle as the most trusted man in America. And you say in your book, Rather, who was apparently the only journalist who reported his viewing of the Zapruder film prior to 1973, curiously reported on 11/15/63 that Kennedy's head snapped forward with considerable violence. So Dan Rather is lying to us when he says that Kennedy's head snapped forward with considerable violence. What do you make of that?
I find it hard to believe that that was his interpretation of the Zapruder film. And in 1976, Dan Rather wrote in a book, The Camera Never Blinks, that it was a regrettable mistake. No doubt he was a young reporter under pressure. I don't think we'll ever know the whole truth on it, but it sure seems to dovetail with a lone assassin from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository shooting from behind the president, as opposed to a shot coming from the right front and the grassy knoll. And CBS was a major asset of the CIA, and Rather was advanced in his career very quickly. You know, I think it's also fair to note that when the Warren Commission came out, on the date it was released, CBS had a 2-hour special illustrating the Warren report. Clearly, it had been leaked to CBS, and they had no critical questions. And the 26 volumes of hearings and exhibits that the 888-page report was based on hadn't been released yet. Nonetheless, CBS had a 2-hour version that completely supported the Warren report. NBC had a 1-hour version completely supporting the Warren report. So while some may seem far-fetched that the CBS would have such close ties with the CIA, I think their subsequent reporting then and their reporting in 67 and reporting subsequent to that would indicate those ties were that close. And, you know, it's ironic that later in Dan Rather's career, he started to take some risks and got fired for actually doing some real reporting in 2004 on George W. Bush's military records. And he got forced out of his position as a mainstream journalist, and ultimately was highly critical of mainstream journalism and their fear to ask the tough questions. But I think he gained that character later in his career.
Well, it would have been nice if he'd had that character a little earlier in his career.
Yeah.
But he was, he displaced Walter Cronkite, probably forced Cronkite to retire early. I mean, that's the kind of, that's how driven he was. So the ACLU, the FBI comes out with its report and it's leaked to the media, and Oswald is the lone assassin and Jack Ruby's doing his patriotic duty. And all these news organizations get in line with it. U.S. News and World Report, amongst many others, the Washington Star, the Chicago Tribune. But then the ACLU says, hold it, there's something wrong here. So the ACLU did the right thing. It was, I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, they were out front on it. And you know, it's interesting, a lot of reporters actually saw the Zapruder film on Vanity Fair. Was a viewing of it, and I think a general sense that maybe this had national security implications, and wait until the Warren report is finished and they give their interpretation of things. So there were some journalists that came forward and tried to do the right thing early on, but they were more marginalized. The story of Mark Lane trying to get in the Nation magazine, trying to get the word out, and that a number of sources turned him down. And it was only a socialist newspaper that printed his critique. So I think there were citizens as well as some in the media that tried to get the information out at first, but the mainstream media wasn't having any part of it during the Warren Commission report. In fact, they were excluded from the report and didn't argue that they should be part of viewing the hearings. So they were leaked information during the report, which kind of readied the public for the findings of the Warren Commission. And there wasn't a hue and cry from the mainstream media to actually view the hearings.
You talk about Mark Lane, and he was an attorney who said that all is not right here. I believe he was a friend of the Kennedys too, I believe.
He worked for John Kennedy
Yes.
in New York in 1960, doing some organizing on the campaign, and was able to glean some of the contradictions early on, and was an outspoken critic. You know, there was a time when he would actually rent out an indie theater in New York and talk about the contradictions that he saw with the case. So he was a bold and vocal critic early on, and it led to some of his work with his writing Rush to Judgment, and then his efforts with the early documentary in 1966 of the same name. Yeah. Where again, he didn't get cooperation from CBS on the outtakes that they had, where CBS was heavily editing the outtakes.
And his work was rejected, as we talked about, by Look, Life, Saturday Evening Post, The New Republic,
right.
The Progressive. Everyone rejected Mark Lane. And he wrote very cogently on this. It wasn't like he was spouting crazed theories. And
he had premature morality and the courage of his convictions. And I agree with you. He was a clear writer. And he was hoping that the Nation magazine would cover things. And I think some of the caution with the alternative media, if I might speculate for a moment, might have been lingering fears of McCarthyism. That's the best I can come up with on this, because they knew him, and the arguments were such that, you know, you'd think they would at least print a truncated version of it, and they passed at first. And they ultimately circled back very cautiously. The alternative media did cover it. You know, it was a lot of citizens that did research, at least as much as the alternative media at first. You know, and it comes back to notions like Howard Zinn have of American history, more of the change coming from the bottom up than from the top down. When the people lead, the leaders will follow. I think it's true on this case, and it's true on the case of who killed Martin Luther King, and it's true of the investigation of 9/11.
So today we don't have political assassinations these days. And my thoughts on that are because our politicians are compromised. There's no need to kill them. The media is controlled and our politicians are compromised. There was J. Edgar Hoover tried to, he recorded Martin Luther King having an affair, and he tried to give that to various media outlets, and they wouldn't touch it. But now I think that a lot of our politicians are compromised, and a lot of the media outlets are compromised, and our politicians, the bad guys don't need to shoot them anymore because they're compromised. What do you think of my theory on that?
I think there's some truth to it. I also think institutions go through cycles. So while the CIA and FBI were more compromised, more under the agenda of powerful people that eluded oversight in Washington, I don't think that's as much the case today. I think it'd be far harder for the CIA or the FBI to be involved as they were in the 1960s. But I also think you're right. Character assassination is very powerful. I also think the public is more sensitive on these issues because to this day, almost 2/3 of the public thinks that John Kennedy was assassinated by a conspiracy and there was a cover-up. So the public is far more suspicious. Social medias can circumvent the mainstream media. I mean, it's the main source used by people under 30 for their news. So I think the political landscape is different today. And I think what you say has a fair amount of truth to it. I mean, it's speculation on our part, but yeah, I think that may well be true.
Well, I've been writing in that area, or researching and writing for 21 years. So I just look at that as like a bona fide reality at this point. Mal, I really want to thank you for coming on the Nick Bryant podcast.
It was wonderful to join you. I think you're doing great work. I appreciate you're taking the risks that you're taking. I think in our country, America is a redemption story. And from the founding, the people fought for the country, revised the Constitution, became the leaders in the abolitionist movement, the progressive movement, the women's movement, the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, the environmental movement, and to monitor the mainstream media. And you're part of it. And as far as I'm concerned, you're doing exemplary work, and it was a pleasure to join you.
Well, thank you, Mal, and have a great night.
You too.
Okay, bye.